So, welcome to the Dojo Book Club. This is part two, but really part one of our investigation of Under the Surface by Jan Markos. In the author's estimation, at least the way he tells it, this is the most important, significant chapter, and he's really laying out some conceptual stuff that to me feels more like a system, if you will, kind of like my system, more than, say, the Gelfand books, which kind of purported to be a system but never felt systematic. And so he's laying down some concepts here that, at the very least, are interesting. And what I've proposed to Kostya is that we just kind of go through them and talk about them critically, whether they make sense, whether they're helpful, and maybe put them in our own words. We're going to try not to do too much of the material itself, because then Jakob Agard will be mad at us for giving too much away on the show, which we don't want to do. We just want to talk about it, and of course you guys can talk about it too. So the intention is, I got this little hand, and the hand, whenever we got the hand, will be what we're talking about. And then, after I thought about putting a clock on us, but, after a certain amount of time, I'm just going to cut it off and we'll move on to the next section. Okay, Kostya, before we start, do you have anything to say, or should we just dive in? Oh, okay, now you're unmuted, buddy.
Okay, that's
So for YouTube, we will edit that all out, and Kostya, just start again, buddy. Just start again.
no problem. So yeah, I was just wondering actually what the chat thought of the book, because we have a channel in the Discord for the book club. People have already been posting a little bit about what they think. It feels like the book is more accessible for the most part. And actually, Jesse, I need to take a quick break. Sorry, I got to run to the bathroom.
That's fine. That's fine.
Real quick.
That's fine.
I apologize. I'll be right back.
So while Kostya's doing that, what I'm gonna try to do is just put put a couple things in my own words, and that is to say that when this book was first introduced to me, several people very much recommended it to me, and it was kind of presented as like a series of chess essays. Thoughts, and I so far don't. I feel like its ambition is far bigger than that, especially when this first chapter, where it's going to try to lay down the law, as it were, about what's going on in the game. And a lot of these things that he's talking about here, all four of them, have big implications in a person's view of chess, I think, when they take it up, or if they accept it. And I think the one thing that I might be different from other chess players is, I do think concepts and metaphors are very important. I think out there's some people, even players stronger than me, who don't think concepts and words are important. I think they're incredibly important. And one just historical note I want to say that's kind of interesting is the English at times in this book is a little hokey, but it should be remembered that German was not Nimzovich's first language either. So a lot of the phrases that he comes up with sound funny in German too. So it's like, there's kind of an interesting thing where I feel like he's not calling it my system or anything like that, but he's kind of going for it. And honestly, I think there's a real need for someone out there to put a book together that is my system. And so far, this book, at least at the very least, is a tentative step in that direction. Okay, Kostya, anything to say before we dive into the faces?
Yeah, so I just wanted to say that I really have been enjoying this book so far. Every time I open it up, it's just kind of like a pleasure to read. Mm-hmm. It's I feel like I don't even need a board, although I've been setting up a few of the positions, but
Right.
a lot of the examples you can just kind of read the notes and internalize it. And for the most part, I think the examples that he uses are really interesting, like really thoughtful. I like that they almost all come from like very modern games with kind of modern openings, not super like classic structures like um there's like one Carlsbad position, but like everything else is kind of like unique. So yeah, I think it's like a really interesting book. Well, we can definitely argue about like how useful it is for low rated players. Like if I read this book when I was 1800, I'm not sure how much like I could really absorb.
Huh.
But like at my current level, I'm like loving like every every second of it because like I feel like the guy just has like a very deep understanding. I mean, I haven't seen too many of like his own games yet, like, but to me it seems like I mean he has a really interesting like conceptualization of chess.
Okay, and I'm gonna say, Kostya, I disagree with you there. We're gonna have some I know we're gonna have some fun disagreements here, but where I disagree is this book, kind of like my system, very accessible. I don't think you don't need to be 1800 to get something out of this. I don't think you need to be super strong to get these four concepts that are laid out in the first chapter. So yeah, I'm gonna argue that like my system, anybody can read it, and you'll take maybe different levels of player will take different things away from it. I think honestly, one of the interesting things about these four concepts is higher rated players might feel like they're above it. But I disagree. I feel like there's things in here where like, oh no, even a high level player, you can think about it. And how you conceptually frame the game, no matter what your level is, I think it's really important because it'll end up seeping into your chess thinking,
Hmm.
these concepts and how you frame it. And I'm pretty sure that I would frame these things differently, and I would write about a lot of them differently. And I'm not sure that these four concepts would be at my beginning when if I were to write a book like this. But how about this? Let's dive in,
Sure.
and I'll try to put the three faces in my own words. In a way, it's a very simple concept, but the idea is that every chess piece has three faces. One face is the one that's most obvious to everybody, which is, I get to do something with this piece.
Hmm.
The second one, that it's vulnerable. I think most people have dropped a piece. They know what that feels like. And the third is that, oh my God, I'm blanking on the third for a second. How could you be
Uh,
blanking on the third?
the the mobility, whether it blocks something.
Right, it's in the way. So you have a lot of
Yeah.
tactics, which are clearance tactics, and the idea is you are in the way of your own stuff, and you see that a lot in positions where somebody lacks space. So I thought we should just talk about this. And is this okay? So let me ask you. I'll just ask it as a question. You can answer it however you want. Because is this a foundational thing, or is this just like a cool, interesting thing to say?
Yeah, it's interesting because it's not something that's very conscious for me. And I would imagine for a lot of strong players, it's like very intuitive when your pieces stand well or not. You just kind of know this piece is well placed, this piece isn't. Um, yeah, like if I think of Agard's like positional play, he has his three rules
Right.
or his three questions, and one of the questions is like, what are the worst placed pieces? He doesn't really give a lot of guidance there uh, to how to actually identify a bad piece. It's more just like you're a strong player, you know what a bad piece looks like. You just have to remind yourself to like look look at the position and like figure out like what's going on. So I think a lot of players you just kind of develop intuitively an understanding like when a knight is well placed, when a bishop is well placed, like whether the piece is doing something, it has some real targets in the position, or it doesn't. It's like clearly misplaced. So yeah, I'm not sure about like um exactly like this way of framing it, like kind of like these like three faces, because I just never thought of it this way, kind of growing up. Um, but it definitely makes sense the way he puts it. I mean, all three things are important. So I imagine it is helpful.
Well, here's a thing. I think maybe I put it in my own words. Like I think most players who've reached a certain level have come to internalize kind of physical pain of when a piece is bad. And that takes a while for people to develop that skill. And it really is something when I'm teaching, I feel like it's one of the things I'm doing again and again is just pointing out when a piece is bad. And I think that's really internalized. And he talks about Rausen and how we, talking to the pieces, that kind of idea, which is really trying to just be explicit about when your pieces are terrible and why they're terrible, right? And that's kind of all, though, the first phase, right? That's the first phase. What can they do? And if you internalize, I think, the three phases, then you are going to really be thinking about the pieces being in the way of each other and the pieces being, he likes, you can tell too, he has an aesthetic appreciation of when the pieces are locked down, like when they're protecting one another. And he's got a whole thing about it, a little bit later in the book too. And it's like, oh, right, okay. So we're going to talk about things being nailed down, if you will. And I guess we've all had that aesthetic appreciation when our position just feels impregnable, right? But right, I've never really put it in words like that.
Yeah, so actually today I had an interesting game that we were going over with my student that I'd be happy to pull up if we can get a board going.
Sure.
Actually, I can. Yeah, I'll put it into our board. And I thought it was actually a good demonstration of one of the three phases, and it's definitely something I do see in a lot of students' games. So hopefully this will be instructive for folks. I think it's like a pretty typical thing.
Okay.
Okay. There we go. I'm just waiting for. Okay, it looks like we're ready. Yeah.
Yeah, it should be going. Yeah, I got it. I see it. Yeah.
I see that. Okay, so yeah, our student is playing black here.
Mm-hmm.
And he ends up playing bishop takes b3, knight takes b3, queen a3. And then white played h takes g6, fg, g4, knight d6, queen d2. And then he got wrecked.
He got wrecked.
And actually, I think it might still be unclear. I haven't checked most of the game with an engine, but already it felt like things were going wrong. Mm-hmm. So my feeling looking at this game was that the problem really started here, where instead of taking on b3, like to me, much more natural was knight b4. So not taking on b3, but saving the threat. So now we're threatening to kind of take and then maybe give queen a2 check if it's annoying. Right. But it can be annoying because if white's queen doesn't keep an eye on this one, then that's going to be a problem. And then I guess the further point here, of course, is that in the game when black took on b3, this is, of course, what freed the d2 square. And without this one, we were analyzing, like, for example, if white had to spend like an extra tempo to get over to the h file, or like f3, queen h2, then black's counterplay is in time. Black goes like knight b5, rook takes e4, and wins in every line. Like, for example, we were thinking like f3, knight b5, queen h2, h5. I thought this was a cool line. And white's not in time to stop rook takes e4.
Okay, yeah. So before, I don't want to get bogged down in the details, but like on knight b4, I'm guessing black could at least be worried about knight c4 there, right?
Yeah, this I felt like would be like a critical try, but I think the analysis was just like take, and then either rook c8 or queen b6. But basically, black has it feels like black has some play against the king here.
Fair enough. And so the point where you're kind of on about is the idea of square clearance here.
Exactly. Right. Yeah, this knight on d2, my student didn't really feel was like in the way of white's position.
Right.
And this is something that I think you kind of eventually you learn to feel this intuitively. If there's no reason to release the tension to take, you kind of look for reasons not to take, to keep the tension.
Right. And, one thing we got to say that happens in this chapter is a lot of times the examples could be about, it's hard to nail down examples, especially in modern games, because modern games have so many themes and tactics running through them. It's hard to nail down like the specific three faces. But yeah, absolutely. And because, like, for example, somebody could show that position and tell a totally different story about releasing the tension, right? And I know there's a lot of players who love to talk about the tension and releasing the tension, and that's a whole topic out there that somebody, honestly, I think somebody did write a book that kind of was, had a whole thesis about how keeping the tension was always the right thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, a very common theme. It comes up.
Yeah.
I feel like it comes up all the time.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Well, we might come back to thinking about the three faces. Let's go on to hierarchy. And Kostya, why don't you summarize that for us?
Okay, so the basic summary here is that because pawns are kind of the least valuable pieces, this is why they lead the way. Well, let me back up a bit. The author's idea, I think, is that there's like a reversed hierarchy. So the lower value of pieces, the more free it is to kind of like walk around, because it basically can be exchanged for anything. It's kind of cool with that. So that's why in the beginning of the game, it's usually pawns that try to occupy the center, because if you occupy the center with your pieces or with your queen, God forbid, then you're just going to get chased around by lesser value pieces. DMR 57 says this was their favorite chapter. Yeah, I mean, definitely an interesting one. This is one that I felt like could be really illuminating if this isn't something you've kind of like thought about before consciously. And this is why a lot of times you might just get like overrun in the opening, because your opponent controls some space, controls some key squares, and your pieces can't really contest in any kind of meaningful way. So yeah, definitely a really interesting idea. He also makes some points about, the stronger the pieces, the less it wants to have a passive role defending something. And I think that's very true. I think in general, I also kind of flip it. When we're defending, we want to try to think about efficient defense and defending with the least amount of material possible. And I do often look for cases where if we have one piece defending something, for instance, a pawn is defending another pawn that's being attacked by several of your opponent's pieces, it's like your one pawn is neutralizing the power of much more material. And this is kind of like economic defense, and it means the rest of your army is free to attack other parts of the board. So to me, this is something that's kind of like maybe a deeper side of chess. Definitely not like super explored, I feel like, but really, really important.
Okay, yeah. Actually, I'll show an example about this. I think is hopefully helpful.
Yeah.
There are many. How come it's not letting me reset the board, Kostya? What have you done? What have you done? Wait, let me try this.
What did I do?
Okay, there we go. So there's many examples that I could show here, but this to me pertains to this question of hierarchy. And there's more than one example I can show, but this is a kind of a fun and famous example. Okay, so what has happened? Black gave up a rook and a pawn, and the knight is at least off sides for the moment, but we just got a bishop. In fact, though, after this move, it's surprisingly really basically all over for white at this point. And I think an interesting way of using hierarchy to talk about this is to say, hey, at the beginning of the game, the rooks ain't worth nothing. The rooks aren't worth anything at the beginning of the game, and the minors will be just amazing at the beginning. Just amazing. There's a lot of sacks in, for example, the Sicilian, other positions where it's hard to understand at first that when you get, say, two pieces for a rook and a pawn, that is not a good deal for the person stealing the rook unless it's way later in the game. Way later in the game with the, let's say a bishop and knight facing the rook and the pawn. Then the rook and the pawn has a real shot. But at this stage of the game, oh no, the rooks are terrible. They're terrible pieces. Yeah. So I think there's a lot of ways in which the hierarchy, especially I like it, it's helpful to think about hierarchy in terms of like, this is the order in which things come out. And most people kind of have a sense of that. But, when you think about it, it's like, well, when the rooks are useful in the opening, usually they're like, say, on E1 or D1 and are doing cool things kind of from the side of the board. My Mexican friend, Julian, always used to love to say, the rooks in the center are, well, I can't say it's an expletive, but the rooks in the center really are terrible pieces. And it's only much later in the game that they can be okay. And the same thing goes for the queen. In the queen ending, that's a famous thing to know, is that, put your centralized, whoever has the centralized queen in the queen end game is a genius. But early in the game, don't bring your queen out early, Josh. Don't do it, right? Don't do it. Yeah.
Okay, so question in the chat from Steve North. Aren't there many situations where you want to over defend? So I think the distinction here is like, yeah, there are many cases where it's nice to have your queen kind of supporting your bishop and everything is kind of nicely defended. But I think the point the author is trying to make is that in general, you don't want like your queen to be the only piece that's defending some kind of key pawn. Because that's not really the job that the queen wants to be doing. The queen wants to be looking for like very active opportunities. So in order to kind of remain harmonious, you kind of want to avoid those situations where your heavy pieces are very, very passive. That's kind of, in general, I think, considered like a last resort. If that's really the only way to defend the pawn, then so be it, but really not an ideal situation. So this is also the chapter where he talks about the crystal.
Right.
And okay, so I have an example on this one, because in my mind, I've always thought of a crystal as like, well, I've always called it an anchor. Especially when a bishop is held down by a pawn and the bishop is defending the pawn. I just feel like this is such a nice construction. So I remember seeing this one game. I'll pull up the position here. This was years ago. Here we go. So this was a game between Magnus and Caruana from 2012. And actually Magnus annotates this one in the Megabase. And his notes are really, really interesting. Like I remember reading them and just being really impressed. So in this position, Magnus is white. He plays the move Queen C4, apparently just defending this one. And according to him, some Russian GM said this was the move of a 1600 level player. Which I thought was really funny. And then the best move, which the engine gives, is like knight h4, which has some tactics. Like if black takes here, for example, it's just one nice line. White goes rook d1, bishop takes d1, rook takes d1, queen goes somewhere terrible. Then rook comes into d7, hitting everything. And if rook e7, there's bishop takes c6. So white just wins.
An engine line, definitely an engine line, yeah.
Yeah, engine line, 100%. Yeah. And then in his notes, Magnus was like, but I didn't like queen c8. And then if g4, queen d8. Very nice move. because otherwise bishop couldn't go to g6. Knight was taking, knight now is attacked, has to go to f5. Now bishop g6, and like, okay, black is kind of okay. So in the game, Magnus goes queen c4, and then Fabi hits him with takes e4.
Mm-hmm.
And then he says, otherwise the pressure would have been unbearable. And then he says, he takes, and he writes, I played this and the next few moves quickly, as I couldn't wait to get to torture him in the endgame. So Fabi takes here, and this line is all kind of forced. Knight e5, queen e2, takes, queen d3. I think this was all calculated. King g2, really strong move. Queen takes e4, bishop d4. So forcing now the trade, queen takes f3, king takes f3. And yeah, basically around here, this was like the endgame Magnus was aiming for. And he like understood that because his bishop has an anchor and black's bishop doesn't, that he's just like long-term better, long-term pressing. And he wins the game, and it's like, I mean, really, really well played endgame. And then the funny thing is, actually, I remember analyzing this game like way back in 2012 and like turning on the engine, and it basically gave white like a small edge, like 0.3 or something. And then as like you play through the game, it like slowly goes up and up and up, and then Magnus ends up winning. But then now today when I turned it on to Stockfish 12, it's like almost decisive for white, like plus 1.5.
Huh.
So Magnus was like just like so ahead of his time, like ahead of the engines, like completely like on another planet. Yeah, so that was cool. I would encourage people to check that game out.
And one thing that's interesting for me about this example, I remember this game vaguely, and let's say before this chapter, before I had ever read this chapter, it wouldn't be popping out to me the idea that it's like we've got a crystal. It wouldn't have been on my mind.
Mm-hmm.
I would have said black's bishop is bad because it has no scope. White's bishop has scope, and white's king is better, and black has a weakness on b7. That to me would have been the heart of the matter, not the crystal. But you know that it's defended. I mean, somewhere in my unconscious that would be a thing, but it wouldn't have been like the main thing. You know, it wouldn't have been like, oh, the crystal. It wouldn't have been in my mind at all.
Yeah, I don't know. This one really made an impression on me. So whenever I get this in an end game, I'm like, oh yeah, anchor, like good.
Right.
I'm always so fair.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, that's helpful. And I think this idea of hierarchy, it's something, you know, it's definitely something that's very provocative. Like it could lead to different ways of thinking about the game. Like there was that thing with the bishop and knight and the rook. And the anchor, of course, is involved in this, where the pawns, you know, lower ranked pieces support stronger pieces. And also, you know, of course, I have a famous saying of pawns aren't people, and that kind of is embodied in this hierarchy thing too, is that the pawns are the low life scum that they are, and they don't rise to the level of pieces. You know, they're way down there. Yeah.
Right.
Okay, cool. Well, let's move on to the next one. And I think if somebody has a question about any of these things, we can definitely go back and think about it some more. And right, I'll try to summarize infection. This word feels a little funny to me, and he uses plague metaphors. I've always, through teaching, I've always talked about poisoning, and I guess it's similar, infection and poisoning. But it's funny, he's talking about, usually in the examples, structural weaknesses in terms of those are the things that hurt you the most and then end up infecting the rest of the position. To me, when I think of poisoning or infection, it's usually a bad piece, and one bad piece then infecting the others, making the others have poor coordination because of the terribleness of their brother that they have to put up with, and then it ends up spoiling the lot. Kind of like a crew with one bad guy in it. It's going to ruin everybody. So that's the way I'll just put it in my own words. But I definitely conceive of it differently because I don't think of it in terms of structural weaknesses. I think of it usually as a piece that's bad. And that might speak really to a little bit of the difference maybe in the chess values between someone like myself and Markos, where I don't respect the structural problems as much as other players do. I know that that's true, and I value more piece activity. So that might be reflected in what we see as the primary sources of infection. Yeah, I think he likes structurally sound positions. This is what I've gotten so far, and he likes things to be nailed down. He likes to be nailed down, as we saw in the second face of the three faces, and of course in hierarchy.
Yeah, it very much feels like there's like this recurring theme of harmony. Everything has to be like harmonious. And when it's not, that's when things go wrong.
Right, and I think for structural players, like maybe I don't know if it's fair to call him a structural player, but they like to feel like their pieces are glued together. They're nailed down, and one of the weird, I think, experiences of the last, I don't know, 30 years of engines is that the engine doesn't care that it's nailed down. It doesn't care at all. It splatters those pieces all over the place. It comes up with all kinds of crazy moves. And then there's a different kind of infection of that kind of thinking of the computer infecting people and, allowing them to be a little bit more fast and loose with their pieces. Especially structurally.
Though now it seems like the new neural net engines, they're like back to kind of valuing the power of a healthy structure more and more.
Maybe. Yeah. So I guess one of the questions I had too about infection was, why is this like a foundational thing or just an interesting thing? Kind of like the first two as well. He's laying down this first chapter and he's clearly like presenting it as significant, but is it just an interesting thing, or is it like something we're going to build on later, That's the thing that I'm confused about.
Not sure, but yeah, all four things are like very fundamental, like putting the pieces on good squares in the right order, making sure your position has no weaknesses. And then once you have these three, then I guess moving to the next one a little bit, like dealing with the opponent's plans and trying to counter them in the best possible way. Definitely feels like very like positional fundamentals, but in a kind of like indirect way. He's like not saying like, this is the most important part of chess strategy. He's just kind of like laying out, these like little I guess conceptualizations of like ways of looking at the game.
Right. In which case, I don't know. Right. It's unclear to me whether we're dealing with a collection of chess essays or like a system. Maybe it's a little bit of both. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we're still to find out.
And on that note, I guess we can come back to any four of these things, but with prophylaxis, I'll let you summarize that, and I have my own, I guess, take on that.
Yeah, so he approaches this one in a really interesting way because, like, a lot of authors treat prophylaxis as kind of like a calculation problem. Like, here's the idea that the opponent wants to do, and then your job is to find some move that like concretely refutes this idea. Like defending a pawn in an indirect way, or just stopping a move because there's some hidden tactic, whereas he puts it more like in the sense of kind of, I don't know how to phrase it exactly. It's like presenting an opportunity cost to the opponent, like setting up in a way where the opponent has choices. They can play on different sides of the board, but whatever they choose, there's always going to be a drawback, and your position is kind of flexible enough to take advantage of that. Especially, I think, with the space advantage, this is kind of important because you have this like freedom to play on either side of the board, and then you can always kind of react to what the opponent is doing, like principle of two weaknesses style. So I'm generally thinking of the Kasparov example right now. If people can think of that one or look that one up in the chapter, where he kind of like keeps his queen semi-active, and this prevents black from being super active on the queen side, which I thought was kind of cool.
Right, just to mention, that's the game from Test of Time against Fedorowicz, the famous Fed. I've always found that, when I read Test of Time, that game was one of the most complicated for me too, about what the heck was going on. Yeah. Okay, so first of all, I guess I should say, he doesn't call it by the traditional name Prophylaxis. He uses the image of a policeman, which I really didn't like that much. And I thought Kostya's take on how other people think about prophylaxis was interesting. To me, I'll put prophylaxis in my own words. Prophylaxis is a real deep revelation to me, as presented by Nimzovich. And it was really like, I feel like one of the, I'll say it's the deepest philosophical concept that I know of in chess, with the idea that, first of all, preventing your opponent from doing what he or she wants to do is, in itself, even though it sounds like a defensive maneuver, it's actually a very aggressive thing. And not only are you, by containing the pieces, you got to see that eventually that's going to turn into an aggression. That's the Nimzovich idea. Jan Markos doesn't go there, but to me, in my own words, that to me is the essence of prophylaxis, is that stopping your opponent from doing what he wants to do will turn into an aggressive action. A simple example, blockading the pawn will end up into the pawn becoming weak and then ultimately taken. And then also, if you imagine, let's say, loads of Sicilian positions where you play g4, g5 to kick the knight on f6, it's not that will turn into an attack, it's that you are taking the knight out of the center. And then that taking out, that controlling of the knight, pinning it down into some terrible square, that will turn into an attack. So I'm talking about it in a different way. And I was a little bit uncomfortable, I'll say, about how he talked about it. In the terms of the policeman of the chessboard, and it wasn't a very long chapter. In any case, when I imagine doing some kind of my system of a chess book, that would be like, a deep discussion about what it is. What it is, yeah.
We're gonna scrutinize it so heavily.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Kostya, what else should we say before we end this first Dojo book club? And let us.
I like what I like what Tim had just said in the chat, that one example of Black's bishop on g7 in the Martel plot, and how it plays a prophylactic role in a sense. That was kind of interesting for me. I've never really thought about it that way, but I guess the idea there is, like in the King's Indian, White either has to allow this like closed kingside attack or allow Black to open up the King's Indian bishop. And a lot of times White prefers not to let that happen.
Actually, let me share a position there, which I think is kind of fascinating. So let me flip this. First, a classic example that he gives is the difference between this position and then this position, where here the bishop is vulnerable but out. You know, everybody feels great that it's out, but it's actually also a vulnerable
Oh, I don't think
piece.
are people seeing the board?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought. Thank you for telling
Yeah.
me. I have to. Let me say it again. So there's the difference between this position, right, where the bishop is bad but safe, and then this position where it's out. And where I wanted to connect this with the Mar del Plata position is there's an interesting variation. I think as probably you have more than one example of this, Kostya, but a surprising thing to me comes about in this, let's call it at least mildly famous position in the Petrosian King's Indian, where we can get this position, f3, bishop h6, rook b1, check to the miserable king, king over, bishop c5. And the first time you see this position, you say to yourself, I did anyway, oh my God, that's terrible. His bad bishop got out, right? But in a lot of ways, it's not too similar to this position. And
So funny.
also when it gets out, and we do this horrendously ugly move, queen c1, what happens is that when he plays f5, maybe he shouldn't play f5, because then the bishop isn't there to take care of all of the drama on the king's side when it opens. And yeah, that was a big surprise to me. And it was right. It's like it has a prophylactic nature on g7. For example, in this position, whenever you take normally in the King's Indian, white's going to pay because the bishop's over here. But now it's not clear who's paying. Now it's not clear who's picking up the bill, Kostya. Yeah. So I thought that was an interesting position. I was just looking at that kind of recently.
Yeah, that's an interesting symmetry. That's nice.
And of course, another classic example that he gives that I think we can all, it's simple but good to think about, is that the bishop on g2, yes, is terrible, but it doesn't prevent necessarily, but it makes it hard for him to open the position. And I think that example, at least rhetorically, helps explain why he uses the term policeman of the board. So in this case, the bishop on g2 is the policeman, the cop, preventing black or making it difficult for black to go crazy with a DC move. And let me just say this, maybe it's just rhetorics and maybe it doesn't matter, but to me the prophylaxis isn't about one piece, of course, it's about like a general strategic plan. So that's where my little quibble's happening.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think of the bishop on g2 as a sniper. I've always thought of the fianchetto bishop like a sniper.
Right.
But yeah, an enforcer.
An enforcer.
Actually, I feel like enforcer might come up later. Word.
Right.
Just ringing a bell.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, Kostya, I'm really enjoying the book, and one of the cool things I liked about the last book club is just that this book club forces me to think about stuff and reread it more than I just would as just a personal alone, and I'm hoping that other people get that as well. And right, I didn't even appreciate that a bunch of people had been posting in the channel, so I'm gonna for next week I'll definitely pay more attention to that as well.
Yeah, people have been discussing it, so yeah, for sure. So for next week we got part 2, which is a little bit longer. So that'll be interesting. Probably we're not going to get to every single chapter in part 2. Maybe we'll just pick our 1 or 2 favorites. And then, yeah, we're thinking about combining parts 3 and 4 eventually, but we'll get to that. But yeah, if you're out there reading the book, we'll be discussing part 2 next week. Yeah, again, such a pleasure to go through a lot of these examples. But yeah, I also like the just the use of excerpts. I like that he just, doesn't show the whole game. You don't have to. If you want the whole game, you can look it up. So it just saves some space and it just shows the key ideas.
One thing actually I want to bring up that important insight that I think you might have been on about too, about like who is the book for, and that is Drittman and Steve North are saying interesting things. In particular, the idea that the book is on a conceptual level okay for, say, a 1600 player, but then when it comes to the examples, that those seem far more advanced. And that makes a certain, like, and he's saying for maybe those are for expert master level players. And certainly to me, I think the examples could have been construed as examples of all kinds of things, right? So even for me, it's like, okay, I get what you're trying to say with the example, but there's so much else going on in these examples, as almost any modern chess game, position will have it, that if you just showed me the examples, it's not like I would have said, oh, that's what, we're talking about hierarchy here, or we're talking about something else. It wouldn't have been totally obvious to me. So whether it's for more advanced players or not, it's not clear to me that the examples necessarily exemplify what the concepts that are being presented, whether they easily exemplify or clearly exemplify what is being said. Though I think everybody kind of at least gets the gist of what is trying to be said, if that makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. Like DMR is saying, he gives this verbal assessment of the position and then goes on to the actual game and analysis. And yeah, I mean, the games are certainly some are very complicated games with tons of tactics. But I mean, I think he kind of leaves it up to the reader. Yeah, if you want to go in and analyze for yourself, I mean, that's certainly valuable. But yeah, I think he's just trying to present the idea and then not get bogged down in variations. Because I mean, maybe it brings up a larger point, but chess is not really about trying to play perfect engine chess, but it's about trying to make good decisions over time and stick to a fundamentally sound strategic play. And so if you kind of if you build up these instincts, that's kind of how you get to a point where you're making fundamentally sound decisions more and more often.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So yeah, next week is a big chapter, and we'll try to go through each of the different headings like we did today, and we'll fight about it a little bit.
Cool. Yeah, we're going to read the whole thing, guys, because I feel like it is a pretty easy read. It's not like you got to sweat through all the variations. So if you're worried about keeping up, just try to read a little bit every day, and I'm sure you'll do fine.
And Levy, as a quick answer to your question, we're trying to figure out whether this is a My System book or just interesting things that you might be able to use in your chess book. And so your question is open still for us. Yeah. Okay, guys, thank you very much. We'll see you next week, same time. Bye-bye.